Welcome to the Targeting Success for Youth video series. Phil here from Peace Education Services. This is question 3 in a video series designed to equip parents and youth leaders to empower youth to make the healthiest decisions around the important issue of teen sexuality. In this video, we are going to address the question, what are the strategies to guide youth in the important area of sexuality? In the overview video, we said that our goal is to get our kids from the island of childhood to the shoreline of adulthood where they can begin achieving their goals. And our most important job is to get them across the risky waters of the youth years where teen sex can have a negative impact on life goal achievement. In the previous videos, we learned that youth sexual activity can have negative, often lifelong consequences, and that some youth are sexually active, resulting in a huge increase in sexually transmitted infection rates and increased depression, social, relational, and economic consequences. We also learned that there are factors in the child's life that contribute toward being either sexually active or abstaining from sex. And it is possible for parents to have some influence over some of these factors. Our job as parents is to empower youth with the knowledge and skills to protect their future by avoiding non-marital sex. In this video, we are going to talk about the history of sex education. It is so important we understand how the current sex ed programs used in schools came to be so that we understand what our children are learning and why. As part of this, we will learn about the greatest influencer of the free love sexual revolution, Alfred Kinsey. Then we will look at the 2 strategies to guide youth, comprehensive sex ed and sexual risk avoidance. Lastly, we'll examine the question, does one strategy work better than another? There are 2 strategies guiding youth about sex: comprehensive sex education and sexual risk avoidance. The strategies do share some common topic content with respect to human development, but when it comes to sexuality topics, each has a different approach. For our purposes, when we talk about the history of sex ed, we're going to cover from 1900 to today and highlight the factors of greatest influence affecting the development of sexual education strategies. From 1900 to the 1930s, there was a problem with sexually transmitted infections, syphilis and gonorrhea. There was no cure for the diseases, and efforts to treat the symptoms were not very successful. So, government strategy to address the problem was to encourage abstaining from sex before marriage and then commit to long-term monogamous marriage and family. During this time, the government implemented programs that would encourage mothers to teach their children about venereal diseases and to abstain from sex. And the YMCA offered programs for boys where doctors would teach about the horrors of venereal diseases and the need to abstain from sex until marriage. In the 1930s and 40s, some schools in the USA and Canada did begin implementing abstinence-based sex education. However, between the 1940s and 50s, there were some significant activities to challenge the abstinence-based culture. The first primary agent of influence was Alfred Kinsey's research on sexuality and the sexual continuum. This eventually had a huge effect on sex education, so it is very important that we look at Kinsey and his research. Alfred Kinsey is often referred to as the father of the sexual revolution. He was a University of Indiana researcher, and he published reports on sexual behavior of the human male and the human female. To understand his work, let's look at his background. As a child, Kinsey was the son of very devout Mennonite parents. But as a young man, he discovered that he was attracted to the same sex. At 25 years of age, he married Clara Macmillan. Early in their marriage, he shared his homosexual and bisexual feelings with his wife, and they agreed to both have sexual relations with others as well as themselves. In his career life, Kinsey graduated from Harvard with a PhD in biology and had a very successful academic career as an entomologist, an insect scientist. So, how did he get from insect scientist to sexologist? Well, it started in 1935 when Kinsey was lecturing at Indiana University. As part of his lecture, he criticized the ignorance of the sexual understanding of humans and shared his view that delayed sexual experience was psychologically harmful. In response to this, the Rockefeller Foundation provided him with funding to study sexual behavior. His research included Kinsey and staff interviewing more than 11,000 people to understand their sexual preferences and experiences. When it came to accessing clients, however, it was difficult for Kinsey to get participants to interview. His research took place during World War II, and most of the men were at war, and the women of the traditional culture of the day were not interested in being surveyed about their sex lives. Because of this, his participants were overrepresented by prisoners, sex workers, homosexuals, and pedophiles. As a result, his data is often criticized as being skewed and not representative of the general population. To determine the sexual interests of children, Kinsey interviewed pedophiles to collect data on how children responded when they were sexually abused. In addition to the interviews, Kinsey, his wife, staff, and clients would observe, film, and participate in all kinds of sexual activities and experiments. Many experts, both on the left and on the right, have criticized his observations and experiments. For example, in his book, Table 34 reports the abuse of 317 children aged 5 months to 14 years. The chart reports the number of times the abuser could make the child orgasm, and it was timed with a stopwatch. Kinsey claimed that although it was reported children were screaming, crying, and striking their abuser, they definitely derived pleasure. How was the data collected? Kinsey claimed he collected his information from other pedophiles who had done the experiments. However, after Kinsey's death, the truth about how the child data was learned. A Nazi pedophile, Fritz Balusek, was being tried for killing a 10-year-old girl in Germany. During the trial, the communication between Kinsey and Balusek was discovered. Kinsey had asked Balusek to commit the heinous experiments and report back to him. Kinsey created the Kinsey scale, also called the heterosexual-homosexual rating scale, which is used to describe a person's sexual orientation based on one's experience and attractions at a given time. The scale ranges from 0, meaning exclusively heterosexual, to 6, meaning exclusively homosexual. A 1 would mean that you were predominantly heterosexual, but incidentally homosexual. A 3 meant that you were equally heterosexual, homosexual. Kinsey reported that a person's sexual rating is fluid and can change over time. It's most interesting that today's comprehensive sex ed programs are telling our children that their sexual orientation and their gender identity can change over time. Some of the conclusions from Kinsey's work include: humans are naturally bisexual. Religious prejudices have forced people into chastity, heterosexuality, and monogamy. Repressing sexual interests and experience can be psychologically harmful. And children are sexual from birth, orgasmic from birth to womb, unharmed and benefit by incest and adult sex, and are psychologically harmed by not engaging in sex. And it is from Kinsey's skewed research that we get the statement that 10% of all humans are homosexual. Although many in secular culture embrace Kinsey's work, there are many critics, both on the right and on the left. He is criticized for his bias, that he was driven by his own sexual interests and needs. His research methodology is criticized for being skewed and not representing the general population. He misrepresented information when he classified some single people in his study as married, which would have skewed his results. He did not have African Americans in his research, but his reports included numerous references to African American participants. He represented the child orgasm tables as collected from multiple sources, when the truth is he had one person commit the heinous acts. He is also criticized for collecting data from pedophiles who overtly abused children, but he did not report these people to police. Despite the critics, Kinsey's research has been embraced by many and is accredited as foundational to the sexual revolution, which has changed the church's influence on sexual issues, and the establishment of comprehensive sex ed in schools, which the foundational principles of are in alignment with Kinsey's conclusions. Now, let's return to the history of sex ed timeline. Once Kinsey released his reports, Planned Parenthood embraced his study and used this research to advocate and rationalize establishing birth control and education clinics across the United States, Canada, and the world. The goal of Planned Parenthood, as communicated in 1953, was to be ready as educators to help young people to obtain sex before marriage. The quote continues to say, in quotes, "In sanctioning sex before marriage, we will prevail and prevent fear and guilt. We must be ready to provide young boys and girls with the best contraceptive measures available so they will have the necessary means to achieve sexual satisfaction without having to risk possible pregnancy." End of quote. It is most important to realize that although Planned Parenthood presents itself as helping families in the area of family planning, a primary goal has always been sexual freedom for youth, and this grew out of Kinsey's research. The last significant influence at this time was Hugh Hefner, the founder of Playboy. While in college, Hefner was a very conservative, sexually abstinent male. When he read Kinsey's report, his thoughts were, "The culture has been lying to me. Kinsey is now teaching me the truth, and I can be sexually free." In his own words, he committed to becoming the pamphleteer of the Kinsey message. He began the porn industry with Playboy, which he said would reflect what Kinsey discovered. Kinsey, Planned Parenthood, and Playboy all contributed to the next step, the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s, which led to increased sexual activity across all the ages, including teens. During the 1960s, Planned Parenthood and Playboy wanted to get the Kinsey message into schools, and in 1964, together, they cooperatively established the SIECUS, the Sexual Information and Education Council of the United States, and its sister Canadian organization, CCAN. By the 1980s and 90s, the increased sexual activity led to a triple problem: high teen pregnancies, an HIV/AIDS crisis, and a new STI, chlamydia. In response to the issue, CSE and CCAN provided the governments with a new sex educational strategy, comprehensive sex education. Comprehensive sex education would provide condoms and help reduce teen pregnancy, HIV, and other sexually transmitted infections. Many school boards jumped on board, but some school boards and teachers were concerned with the change and either continued the abstinence sex ed messaging or significantly modified the new program. During the early 2000s, comprehensive sex ed gained steam, and researchers were watching for the positive results. By 2015, teen pregnancies did reduce. CSE advocates claimed it was because of increased condom use, but unbiased researchers examining the data could not determine if the reduction was due to condom use or a shift in sexual activity or a number of other possibilities. Although teen pregnancies had decreased, researchers found that teen STI rates, depression, and other negative consequences had increased greatly. During this time, the abstinence-based groups started to examine their approach. They began to embrace an evidence-based, medically accurate primary prevention approach, which was in alignment with the public health primary prevention strategy. Primary prevention is the approach used to teach youth about other at-risk activities like smoking, drugs, and alcohol, where youth would be taught first about the dangers and the strategies to avoid these at-risk activities. So, a new sexual health strategy was being established, sexual risk avoidance. SRA programs began to develop and started to be scientifically tested in public schools, and it was found that many of them reduce teen sex, which reduces pregnancy and STIs. These programs began to gain some acceptance in schools, and the US government began providing some funding. CSE advocates, in response to the criticism of their programs and the development of a competitor, shifted their rationale from a focus on prevention to a new rationale, sex ed for social change. Comprehensive sex ed programs expanded to include mandatory topics of reproductive justice, LGBTQ equality, gender equity, and the dismantling of white supremacy. So, we currently have two strategies to guide youth in this important area of life. Comprehensive sex education, which is the dominant strategy in schools, and the CSE ideologies are driven by Planned Parenthood through their educational organizations, CCAN and CSE. The second strategy is sexual risk avoidance, which is medically accurate, evidence-based, and founded upon the proven public health strategy of primary prevention. In the next section of this video, we will dive into the details of what a comprehensive sex ed program looks like in schools.